Good morning from Dallas. We are here with Craig Stewart from Phrase, and we're going to have a really interesting Luke discussion. I count on it from phrase to function, Craig, so to speak. Let's talk a little bit about re-engineering localization for the Gen AI age. And what better person than to guide us through that than the guy who's responsible for Gen AI at Phrase, and that's Craig Stewart. Craig, I didn't nearly do you justice, so why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience for a second so we kind of know a bit more about you?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Stefan. Thanks for having me. So I'm Craig Stewart. I'm currently Director of AI Research at Phrase. I lead the AI Research Division and all of the cool stuff that we're putting into our products. Um, I have a background in machine translation evaluation. I was one of the co-architects on the Comet MT evaluation metric, which is now an MT evaluation standard across the industry. And so I'm very, very passionate about evaluation in particular. So I'm hoping that we'll get to touch on some of that today. But I've been at Phrase for a couple of years. Prior to that, I was at Babel as well, where of course I developed the Comet metric and worked with some great people over there. And then prior to that, again, I was at CMU, came out of Carnegie Mellon University. So yeah, very excited to
Let's
be here. Thanks,
let's dive
Stefan.
in. Let's dive into the
Let's
metrics.
go.
Let's dive into the metrics right away. And
Yeah.
one of the things that I believe is happening is that we're rethinking quality a little bit. And let me fire off a juicy question right away. Why do traditional metrics like MQM fail to resonate beyond the localization world, do you think?
Yeah, I think we've gotten ourselves very, very focused on linguistic quality. I think a lot of the automation that has happened in localization over the past 20 years or so have been applied in the areas where there's been the lowest risk, right? So we're talking things like user-generated content and low impact content that can survive with, some of the failings of machine translation, right? As long as you're getting the message across and you're getting it out the door, you're probably doing the right thing. So automation fits pretty well there. And as the quality of the machine translation has improved, and especially now with more options for adapting and refining the output with LLMs, the requirements for evaluating that have grown. And that's why we've run into things like MQM, right? So an MQM again is mostly focused on linguistic quality. There are elements in there that lean towards fitness for purpose, which is like the holy grail for machine translation quality in particular, right? Getting at really what matters to the customer on the end user. So I think that we have had our eyes mostly on linguistic quality. But what we're finding now, I think, is that as we shift towards a world where LLMs are kind of doing a lot more than just translation, right? Transcreating content, adapting content, converting content, changing content. We're finding that there is opportunity to talk to a broader level of the content flow, right? And to try to talk to content managers and content creators and executives. And aiming at linguistic quality is the basis for that discussion. Slightly falls short of what we're trying to do, I think.
Yeah, and talking about outcomes, that's probably the area where we need to focus on a bit more if we're going to translate what's important to us to a broader audience. Wouldn't you agree?
Exactly. For me in particular, I mean, I mentioned fitness for purpose before, and I talk about fitness for purpose quite a bit. And to be completely honest with you, my definition of fitness for purpose is evolving continually, right? I think back when we were looking at Comet in particular, we were really, really interested in moving beyond the capability of like the blur metric, for example, to focus on the lexical level and understand how similar a translation was to a singular reference translation and going much further beyond that to think about, really get into the semantics of what was actually intended with the content. And beyond that, you think about things like the company style or brand that they're trying to convey. And you hope with a metric like Comet that a lot of that is conveyed within the reference translation. So you hope that those types of metrics are useful at capturing that. But of course, fitness for purpose means so much more. And I think where we are right now is coming to a place of understanding that localization, for me, is about the creation of a parallel experience in a target culture or a target market, right? It's not just about translating content. It's not just about taking a source piece of content and replicating that exactly with linguistic accuracy in the target culture. It's about providing the end user in that target culture or target market with an experience that makes them feel like it was intended for them in the first place.
Yeah, and if we're going to be talking to C-level stakeholders outside of the traditional localization realm, we're going to have to talk to them in terms that they understand a bit better. Might not even be linguistic,
That's right.
like engagement or conversions. Does that align with
Yeah,
your vision as well?
absolutely. And I think, to be honest, I think we've not really explored that dimension enough. I mean, I think it's very, very clear that there are obvious, financial and commercial interests in all of this, right? Especially if you're an enterprise company trying to push content into different markets. Your end goal is expansion, right? And getting more people to use your product or service. And that involves talking to the people in that culture, whether it be through customer service or product description or listings or what have you. Um, and linguistic accuracy of the language that you're using to talk to those people is just really just one small dimension of what you're trying to do. And so there are other metrics and things like engagement metrics, conversion rates, if you're running a website, things like bounce rate, click-through rate, those kinds of things that are extremely important to think about as well at the broader level. And obviously at the executive level, there's the commercial aspects and metrics and KPIs there as well. And I feel that we're at a point where we're starting to have our eyes on that realm and those dimensions as well, just beyond linguistic quality.
What practical efforts can LSPs, language service providers, engage in order to get involved with those types of things, you think?
So LSPs in particular, it's interesting that I talk a lot about style guides because that's something that LSPs can help their customers with, and what that is rooted in is trying to kind of represent the customer expectation, right? Is that you're trying to provide documentation, provide a singular source of truth by which you can articulate the company style. Company style is just one of those dimensions, and I wonder if there's an extension of a style guide that includes the more peripheral interests of the target customer, things like what engagement means to that customer that can be built into those types of
Mm.
resources in particular.
Yeah.
That might be one way that LSPs can think about it.
Yeah, what's your take on using real-time feedback loops, some form of A/B testing as a quality evaluation tool?
Definitely. And I think that's probably the easiest way to get at those types of metrics, things like engagement metrics. And if you're able to set that up, and if LSPs in particular are able to assist in doing that, that's great. I think the challenge we have is that, especially some of the bigger enterprises that are very kind of fractured in the sense that they're a little bit split from those types of metrics and the teams that run those types of tests and can provide that type of information. And so it's all very well for me to talk about engagement as being kind of the new frontier of evaluation,
Yeah.
but there's quite a long way to go in tying closing some of those gaps. We have some customers at Phrase who are of a smaller scale and they're very, very tied into the content flow, right? They work very closely with the content teams, and for those smaller scale teams, it's much easier to have oversight and the context of those engagement metrics. For much larger companies, that's a much bigger problem, and one that I think it's a hurdle that we'll have to overcome in the next 6 months or so.
Yeah. Speaking of phrase, want to dig in there a little bit deeper, maybe for a second. How can a tool
Yeah.
like phrase help customers transition from, linguistic error counting to value, the kind of value measurement that we've been talking about in the past 10 minutes?
It's something we're very actively thinking about. So one of the things that we're really engaged in, I think I'll speak from two perspectives. One of them is in analytics. We're really keen on the analytics side to start servicing as many metrics as we can. Um, Not quite all the way there yet. We're still focused on the quality metrics ourselves internally at Phrase, just because, of course, those are the things that resonate most with customers using the platform, right? Those are the things that they want to hear about at the moment. But we have some initiatives where we're working with customers to understand what the bigger picture looks like. What are some of those KPIs and metrics? And our analytics platform is a place for that. And I think that once we can tie in and tap into ways that we can have customers, do things like A/B testing and interact with the platform in a way that stores results alongside their quality metrics, that's going to give a really, really nice picture for customers, I think. And that's I think a vision of mine, I think, for the platform is really beefing up that analytics capability. The other side of things for me is in capturing customer expectation as well, and not just the expectation at a linguistic level, but really getting to the root of, we talked about style guides already, trying to
Yeah.
understand, more broadly what fitness for purpose means, whether that means whether that's articulated in terms of engagement metrics or style or brand, trying to get better at capturing and profiling customer expectation is a current research focus of ours as well.
Yeah. One of the tendencies or trends that I've been seeing is that there's efforts from outside of localization to kind of do some of the stuff that we do and roll it into other activities, so to speak. And localization teams might be bypassed altogether. I think we call it
Yeah,
shadow localization on some
right.
level. What exactly is that, and why should we be concerned, you think?
It's the content ninjas, right? People doing it themselves in the dark. Yeah, no, I hear that quite a lot. And that's a real concern for, especially I mentioned before, localized teams that are kind of embedded within larger organizational structures, right? They act as a kind of a compliance team in the middle of a content flow. And I think what is inevitably happening, and we see this in lots of different forms in lots of different places, but mostly other teams within the business who have a requirement for localization going and using things like tools like Google Translate and trying to use, especially now with broad access to things like ChatGPT, just going and trying to do it themselves as a means of circumventing process around, going around the localization team just to get the job done. I think there's an art in localization, right? We understand that what the localization team is trying to do is very nuanced and very deep. And at the individual language level, there are a number of nuanced cultural requirements that the localization team is trying to maintain. And they're doing that for a very good reason, right? Is that we understand, and the localization team understands that that is exactly what drives engagement downstream, right? If you're talking to somebody in Japan, for example, the tenets of Japanese culture and the nuances of Japanese culture are very, 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 very important to tie in. And what happens, I think, is the result of this shadow localization is, at least the conversations that I've had, is a lot of the fallout comes back on the localization team, where there's been teams internally in an organization who are just using whatever tools they can find on the internet to translate stuff. It's normally the localization team that then gets blamed for any customer complaint
Yeah,
downstream, which is a really terrible shame. But
yeah.
that's kind of where we are at the moment.
Do you see it more as a threat or an opportunity for new tooling and in
I'm a
search for
very
new?
Stefan, I'm a very optimistic person, so of
Okay.
course I'm going to say it's an opportunity. I mean, I really believe that, though. I think that the more that we dig into this question, the more I see that there are lots of opportunities for localization teams to really stick a flag in the ground and say, no, no, look. And I hope I don't know to what extent, localization teams are feeling the pain of what I've described, right? Coming back and having to deal with the fallout of this type of shadow localization. But I really do feel that there is pause for and for LSPs and technology providers as well to work with their customers and understand how it is that we might have localization teams really kind of represent their interests and build an understanding in the wider organization that no, you can't just translate content and just push it to a target culture. There's much more that you have to think about, and there's significant risk involved in just doing it that way.
Yeah. Maybe we should be involved in the marketing of those ideas. Do you think we should put guardrails in place and help companies put guardrails in place to prevent brand or compliance risks from this kind of shadow localization?
Yeah, I think it's, and we're also, we talked a little bit before about, the types of content, right? And I think that where this happens a lot, there's this sort of especially with like lower in impact content, like user generated content and things, it's very tempting to do this because you know that it really doesn't matter to the end user downstream the quality of the translation. So you can just push automation. And that's where automation has existed for a time. Um, but of course, it really gets risky where you start pushing into that higher risk area. And I think that's where we need to help localization teams stand on their feet and say, no, there's actual commercial risk involved. And sometimes regulatory risk. I mean, it's very easy to have a conversation where there's regulation involved, right? And I think for localization teams who are dealing with, highly risky content and regulated content, that's a very easy to conversation to have. It's in that middle ground, and this is where we're starting to encroach with the technology at the moment and using LLMs to do a little bit more content generation adaptation in that middle ground where, it's not quite the lower end of the spectrum of user generated content or content that can, good enough translation is fine. But in the realm of content, things like marketing content, where, yeah, it's important to get the message right and it's important to have the cultural nuance. And there are impacts on things like engagement downstream.
Yeah, I've been a big advocate of breaking out of the translation box and designing AI workflows, maybe
Yeah.
with the eye on multilingual content creation. So let's talk about that for a minute. Where do you see the boundaries between translation and multilingual content creation starting to blur a little bit?
Oh, let me, that kind of hints at our conversation we've just had, right? Is that um, I think a lot of the motivation that I'm talking about content teams specifically, maybe marketing teams, and documentation teams, and other types of teams as well, different for different scenarios. But a lot of the motivation for kind of shadow localization comes from the fact that now teams can just generate content themselves, right? Um, and of course, they would be tempted to try to do that multilingually. They say, "We'll give you the same content in Italian if you can." um, and then just assume that it's okay. And maybe they have an Italian friend who can verify that the language looks okay and push it out the door. So I think the lines are already very blurred with just the fact that those content teams are generating the content and trying to use it. Um, I also think it would be wise for us to start, dissolving those lines ourselves and start
Yeah.
thinking about, the role of localization. I mean, you said it exactly right. I love what your take on it. Thinking outside of the translation box is trying to dissolve that boundary and thinking about the role of translation in a broader context of like a content creation flow. I think that's very, very important.
Yeah, how is Phrase rethinking those workflows, and are you working on accommodating content creation in the way that we just discussed?
Definitely. One of my, I think, personal goals from day one when I came in the door at Phrase 2 years ago was to start thinking about future-proofing the platform with a modular architecture and a framework that allows the accommodation of lots of different types of content generation. And so we've been working on things specifically in a modular fashion such that you can we have an orchestration layer in the platform that allows you to tie these pieces together. But specifically because of the fact we recognize that at some point there's going to be a shift that's not just translation, right? For example, we have a quality framework where we have different pieces of quality technology that, again, for the moment, allow you to evaluate linguistic quality. But we frame it in such a way and we provide the facility and the tooling such that people could, if they wanted to, go directly into a target language with content generation and still use the remainder of the platform and the tooling that we have to guarantee some minimal success. So that's been a core focus of mine, and I'm hoping that this sort of modular orchestration approach is something that will help us to accommodate that in the future.
How does the localization process look different, in your opinion, when source content itself is AI generated and maybe there isn't even source? I actually wrote an article this week how there's a certain tendency towards going sourceless. That it's a big word, of course. It doesn't mean completely sourceless, but it means essentially intent localization, where content might be created on the fly in a bunch of different languages. What do you think
Well,
the
I would
activities are going to
say,
look like?
yeah. First off, it's not just about sourceless, right? It's about the fact that, in particular, Now with, just with ChatGPT, you can throw an image in there, right? We've
Yeah,
gone already, we've taken a leap to being multimodal without even realizing it,
yeah,
right? It's that we now suddenly have the opportunity where the source itself doesn't have to come in as text. It could be an image or a website or a video or audio or something else that is
yeah,
other than text. So that's one dimension of it too, is that now you really have to treat the source as something very abstract. It doesn't necessarily have to be text in itself. Um, so I think that the one thing, and again, I'm actually quite pleased because I wanted to talk about valuation and we've gotten here already. But the thing that I think about most when I think
mhm,
about this sourceless problem is the evaluation side of things, and I think that is the biggest chasm of a gap that we have at the moment as an industry is trying to figure out how on earth we evaluate content coming out of these types of sourceless streams, right? When you have a Comet is a great place to think about this, right? Because the Comet relies entirely on there being a singular reference translation. It can also work with multiple references. I mean, that's the kind of the ideal. If you've got a piece of text, well, okay, if you've got three different translations, then you can get an even better idea of what the translation should look like. But if you don't even have a source to begin with, and all you've got is an
yeah,
output text, you're in trouble,
yeah.
right? And I think there's
You
I
still
would
need
suggest
you need a human linguist, though, in my mind. You need
yes.
somebody to be the fail-safe and to review whether this content can go out.
And
As
yeah, that's the art. That's the art of localization, right? That's what I'm referring to before. And that's, I think, the gap between in understanding that we have to start bridging when we talk to people outside of the localization space, right? Is that I think it's very, very easy for somebody to assume just because they can produce a piece of content in English that works very, very well, that they could go into any language they want and have the same
right,
result. And we know that not to be the case. And in fact,
yeah,
down the long tail of languages, results can be disastrous if you try to do that, right? You
yeah,
start trying to play around with lower resource languages, and suddenly you're in trouble. And I think that that's an area in particular, at least philosophically, that we need to start thinking about as an industry.
yeah. Who's the content owner when in that kind of workflow? Is it the marketer, the linguist, the model? Who's the arbiter?
That's a very good question. I don't feel qualified to answer. Um, and it really depends on your organizational structure. I mentioned
Mm,
the kind of the difference between different setups where localization teams are more or less integrated into the content flow. Um, if you have a content team that is happy to claim ownership of that, then that's great. But a lot of the time, and I've mentioned before, the challenges of shadow localization, that the responsibility and the accountability ends up falling back on the localization team, which I think is maybe problematic in some cases, especially with the problems of shadow localization. So that's a
yeah,
very, very gray area. One I would not like to stake a claim in the ground on.
no, and
That's
I've been bending my mind in a pretzel a little bit about some of these. If you think it through a little bit further, once you get away from a single source, what does that do for source
yeah,
language independence, and how do you ensure a brand voice and intent are preserved when a large language model is creating the content directly in multiple languages? What does
yeah.
that mean?
Yeah, and I think
Uh,
that as we think more about this broader content flow, I think ownership sits with the content teams. I think that's if I had to guess and I had to make a stab at the question, that's where I would throw an answer for the time being, without the qualifications to say it with any certainty. But that's kind of my best guess for the time
There's going
being.
to be lots of linguists interested in this take, though, because I do see an opportunity for human linguists to pivot and become content strategists in this new
Yes,
model and provide for a new opportunity. Wouldn't you agree?
yes, and the linguists are the last bastion of defense again. I think that when we talk about that end user experience in the target culture, the linguists are the SMEs. The linguists have the knowledge, the cultural knowledge, and the ability to shape content in a way that will resonate with that target culture. And I think that framing the role of linguists as content strategists is very, very clever. I think that's really a good direction for discussion. The idea that linguists are now the subject matter experts when it comes to the cultural nuance of the target culture and being able to articulate and evaluate exactly what will land in that target culture, what will resonate most, what will drive engagement most in those target markets.
Yeah, we hear a lot of doom and gloom out of the translator side, so to speak, but I would think that this is a great opportunity and motivator to stay abreast of prompt engineering and focus on the role of fine-tuning multilingual content creation. Wouldn't you agree?
I think getting ahead on the technology is probably the best thing anybody in that space can do right now, and that's been my message. So I work closely. We have an academic program at Phrase, and we have some personal contacts with people in academia, and I've been talking in particular to program um, designers, instructional designers, and students and professors, and trying to understand, what does the future of the field look like for new people coming in and new people in that trajectory. And I think that the one thing that is very, very clear is as content teams, if we go back to that discussion, as they get better at doing it themselves, we need to counter that on the linguist side with content strategists that have, very, very sound technical skill, that they're very, very versed in the use of course, platforms like Phrase to build workflows that get a result that guarantees resonance downstream. I
Yeah,
think that's very important.
very interesting. I want to talk about a different topic for a second here and
So
about the difference between low impact and high impact content. As somebody who's involved with Gen AI on a daily basis, you're probably familiar with the fact that most of the content that's machine translated or AI machine translated, if you want to call it that right now, remains to be low impact content. How can we change it and focus on high impact content as well, and what needs to change in order to gain that level of confidence?
yeah, I see it as a an incremental transition. I think that trust is not something that's gained overnight, right? It's something that grows. And I think the more and more we see Gen AI in particular dealing with higher impact content, and when I say higher, I mean incrementally higher from the lower impact content, right? I mean, bleeding into the kind of the middle ground before we go all the way to the top. I mean, at the top end of the spectrum, I see things like medical and legal, where there's regulation,
Mm.
of course, and of course there's like ISO standards like 5060 that can better guarantee that a human has oversight there, and of course that will remain. Um, but I think we can see already areas in which the use of Gen AI in particular is bleeding into that middle ground, where there's content that is not just about getting the message across, but it's about getting the message, landing the message well. I think is the difference.
Is that maybe an area too where we could help our customers make the distinction between what's safe to generate via AI and
Yeah,
what's not in some kind of a QA step? I'm just thinking out of
and
the
we're
box here.
yeah,
Yeah, does that make sense? Like, oh, be careful when you do this because that might have
absolutely.
legal
And
implications.
And we're back to evaluation again. I think
Yeah,
this is my favorite topic, and for
yeah.
good reason, because it's so deep and so nuanced. And what you're talking about is yeah, exactly that, right? I think that evaluation as it is, I mean, of course, human evaluation with frameworks like MQM touch on this, right? And especially if you have some kind of guide or special instruction to the linguists, the annotators who are doing the review, that's fine. But I see it as a personal responsibility on the automation side to come up with mechanisms that help us to start to articulate that at scale. Because that's the hardest thing with any of this, right? Is that we're faced with this gigantic wave of content generation, right? The
Yeah.
amount of content that we suddenly have to handle has just exploded, right? And of course, we can rely on humans to do the evaluation. Of course, we can lean into frameworks like MQM to get a robust picture on this small sample of content over here, but it doesn't scale and it doesn't hold. And I think automation, or at least development technology that can enable at least partial automation of that is really, really important. And that's where I spend most of my days and nights thinking, right? How can we not just represent linguistic quality, but also, the fitness for purpose, and of course the higher impact things like the chance that maybe you'll be breaching some regulation, for example, or other dimensions to quality that we might want to consider.
So, which side of the fence do you fall on? Do you still think that post editing is the right model for high impact AI content, or are we edging our way towards building a system in which we can feel comfortable that we can
Uh,
fully automate certain
yeah.
things and put some different guardrails in place?
Post edit distance and the use of post edit metrics is a really, really tricky place to be because there are significant pros and cons, right? Is that you understand that if somebody has looked at the content and edited it, they were doing something. What we find though is that it's never clear, especially at the post-edit level or the segment level, when you're looking at post-edit metrics, what exactly the editor was trying to do, what exactly they were trying to reflect, and trying to kind of interpret those scores and rely on those scores and then build technology that automates on generation of those scores is very, very problematic. And that's why, for some time we've been leaning into, and Fraser's doing it and others are doing it as well, but leaning towards, prediction of things like MQM is that that there was at least a granular framework behind the generation of the evaluation that allows you to develop tech that is semi-reliable. Post editing is a bit of a wild beast to tame when it comes to automation. The data, I can give you examples, of, not right now while speaking, but I could show you examples offline of post edits that are wildly different, and also inconsistent as well, right? This the sense that you can have the same editor look at the same piece of text twice, and they'll give you two different answers. And that makes the development of metrics on top of post edit a little bit tricky. However, that said, there are flaws, and we've talked about this last week, but there are flaws in automated metrics and automated evaluation tools in that they don't necessarily capture the full spectrum of fitness for purpose that maybe the post-edit metrics see, even if they don't necessarily reflect it consistently. There are gaps, right? So any kind of QE system, for example, that is based at a segment level is going to struggle to understand fitness for purpose all the way down to resonance downstream, right? A QE system cannot tell you how well the content will resonate downstream, and that's the gap that we'd love to bridge at the
Very,
moment.
very, very, very interesting. Of course, if the more we talk about multilingual content creation, the more the need seems to be obvious for us to be able to talk to stakeholders outside of our regular localization experience. So how can localization become relevant to those stakeholders, you think, in product and in marketing and customer experience? What are the
I think it's
best
in, yeah.
techniques?
I mean, let's, be honest, I think commercial risk is a big one, right? That's a very easy game to play, is that if you can demonstrate commercial risk,
Mm.
you can get buy-in. And that's one area in which I think things like resonance and those types of KPIs that address engagement and things like that are really, really interesting because a customer can look at your website imagine this is a Japanese customer that comes to your website and reads the content that your content team has generated for them in a target culture, and decide not to buy the product or just to bounce from the website and go somewhere else. And it's a very easy way to demonstrate commercial risk, right? Is if you can start to kind of tap into those engagement metrics, and that's kind of where I'm thinking at the moment as a direction. That's the one place that we'll, I think, start.
Yeah.
Um,
Maybe
yeah,
one final question that I wanted to ask specifically about phrase, since you're working
yeah.
on new initiatives, I assume as the Gen AI guy. What's the most exciting thing that you are working on currently that you're allowed to talk about on camera?
Well, I can maybe touch on a couple things. So we just released Phrase Studio, and I think that that is that's been a something in the Phrase product that has, this is so Phrase Studio is a platform that enables things like subtitling and dubbing, and transcription, things like that. Um, but it's obviously a step towards multimodal, and we touched on this before, right? Is that I think the content game now is shifting towards multimodal applications. I think now, things like audio and video are becoming increasingly important, and building an infrastructure that enables customers to do more of that, I think, in multimodal ways is really important. So that, I mean, to highlight as I guess, a cool piece of new tech that's out, that's the one thing I would highlight. From a personal perspective, though, I think the one thing I'm really, really interested and excited about is, capturing this. I've mentioned it at the start of this, the fitness for purpose, right? And this is in two flavors for us, and one of them is in profiling expectations. So, really kind of thinking about the style guide, for example. What are ways in which we can both refine that and align it with the expectations of the broader content flow, speak in the language of the content creators, right? And how we can represent the end user customer interest in profiling. So we're thinking about ways in which we can change that. The other thing, and I guess the last thing I'll highlight is the importance of assets, right? We didn't get a chance to talk about things like translation memories and terminology bases and things like that. Those are of super interest to us at Phrase at the moment, and really helping customers to understand how they can use these old world assets like translation memories in the context of the new world. Because, for many, many years, some of these teams have been building translation memories, for example, that are just humongous, huge assets to and they're a little bit unruly sometimes, but they really are, the best source of truth in terms of, what does resonate, what works, what is the company style and brand and voice. And I think trying to get hold of those and wrangle those assets into something that's more manageable and usable, that we can curate and rely on in using the generative AI technology, that's the number one thing I think is going to drive us towards fitness for purpose. And I'm very excited about that.
All right, that's great to hear. Thank you so much, Craig, for spending some time with us today.
Yeah.
This
Thanks
was a
for having me.
fascinating discussion. We could go on for a little while, I'm sure, and maybe it'll be a second edition one of these days. I'll call you back in
That'd be great.
and we'll talk some more. But thank you so very much for sharing your insights, and we look forward to keeping tabs on Phrase and see what you guys do exciting next.
Appreciate it. Happy to be here.